So I'm really happy to be among linguists. I was saying at lunchtime, and philosophers too, so don't let me disrespect the philosophers, and jurists, if we have any jurists in the room.
Disaffiliated.
But one of the nice things for me about being among linguists and not lawyers is that I don't feel like I have to be right. In fact, it always troubles me a little bit. We were talking about this at lunch. When I hear linguists or other scientists saying that they're arguing for a position as if scientists were advocates for ideas, I think that comes with all kinds of trouble that maybe we could discuss over coffee. But again, I understand how easy it is to have your ego wrapped up in your work, but in a way, I'm not afraid of being wrong, and I suspect that many of you will suggest that I am wrong, and for me that's kind of okay, right? The goal of science in a way is to be a little less wrong each time, because probably none of us is exactly right, given our position in the story that will continue. There are two questions that I'm interested in. One of them is whether contractual offers are conditional promises, which is often taken to be the case in the legal literature. And then the second question related to the first is why certain linguistic expressions are interpretable only as bilateral contractual offers. Now, for those of you who aren't lawyers or jurists, you probably don't know what that means, and you may not even know what a contract is, so I think we'll start with a little bit of background in contracts. So basics of contract formation here in section 1. For our purposes, a contract is defined as a series of events via which two speakers of a language, in our case English, come to create reciprocal rights and duties. So for example, in 1, if speaker A says to speaker B, if you wash my car, I'll give you $20, and speaker B responds with, I accept, right? As a result of this conversation, speaker A has a duty to pay and a corresponding right to a washing. And reciprocally, speaker B has a duty to wash and a corresponding right to payment. In other words, by virtue of the language that's been uttered, something has changed in the world with respect to liability. Now, as linguists, of course, we're not really interested in whether the law would recognize the conversation in 1 and 2 as creating a legally enforceable obligation, nor are we particularly interested in whether the speakers A and B themselves would describe the relationship as a contractual relationship, but some legal terminology will still be helpful. So under American law, in order to form a contract, you need 3 things: offer, acceptance, and consideration. The last element sort of gets at the idea that in order for speaker B to have a right to speaker A's performance, speaker B must agree to do something reciprocally. In other words, if the conversation had been different, if it had gone as it goes in 3 and 4, speaker A says, I'll give you $20, and speaker B says, thanks, that doesn't create a contract. It might create an obligation, but to keep it, with no disrespect to anyone who might teach contracts in the room, right, to keep it simple, the law will distinguish the conversation in 1 and 2 from 3 and 4 effectively in the following way. There's a right to the $20 and there's a right to a washing in the first conversation. In the second, there's probably no right to the $20, but there's a right to recover any lost value in reliance on the promise to give $20. And you may say, okay, that means nothing to me. It sure seems to me like in both scenarios, speaker A owes $20. There's some kind of intuitive obligation. And I would agree, but I don't think that that means that offers are the same thing as promises. So it's sort of been suggested for decades that a difference between an offer and a promise is that an offer requires something in order to create a commitment, namely an acceptance. Whereas a promise is something that can be made and create a liability without there being an acceptance. So I haven't reflected it here in the handout, but imagine a scenario where you need for me to drive you to the airport next week. Well, let's compare a couple of conversations. The first one not being a conversation at all, I call you up and I leave you a voicemail that says, I'll drive you to the airport next week. Now, if I call you up a little bit later and leave you another voicemail that says, sorry, I have to take that back, right? Ask yourself, if you were the person saying that, how you would feel, right? You'd feel a little, right? I'm going back on my word. Compare that with a scenario where I say something like the following, or you say something like the following. Call me up and say, if you drive me to the airport tomorrow, I'll drive you to the airport next week. Nothing happens, but then you discover actually that you're unavailable next week, so what do? You call the other person up and you say, sorry, but I have to take that back. You just don't feel as bad, do you? I mean, most native speakers of English at least, and I think that there are interesting cultural issues beyond language issues that come into play, but the idea for people who believe what I believe is that there's a distinction between offers and promises in this respect, namely that an offer actually requires an acceptance in order to create liability, whereas in some way a promise does not. That doesn't mean that promises don't have to be taken or something along those lines, but there seems to be a kind of linguistic distinction. Now, if you believe in such a thing as promises, you probably also believe in such a thing as conditional promises. So if you look, for example, at 6, if you need money, I'll send you $20, right? So this is maybe a conditional gift or a conditional promise. My promise is effective only if you actually need it or demonstrate need for it. You can put any kind of condition you might want onto a promise. So a very natural thing to assume once you believe in conditional promises is to say that contractual offers are conditional promises, where the condition is performance or promise to perform, as it were, right, from the party that you're interacting with. And that's, for the most part, the way the linguists who've looked at this in the past have taken it. So one of the things I'm going to sort of suggest and not argue is that there may not be any sound linguistic reasons for saying that contractual offers are conditional promises. Before we go into the linguistics, though, one more distinction is going to be important to us. Unilateral versus bilateral offers. So the idea behind a unilateral offer is that it can be accepted only by performance. What do I mean by that? That means something along the lines of, if I put out a reward offer, find my lost dog and I'll give you $100. Or find my lost wallet, return it to me, I'll give you $100. The idea is that there's no liability on my part. I'm not bound to any promise until you actually find it and return it to me. So I can sort of take my offer back. Even if you promise me to go looking for it, right? That's not enough to create the liability. And you might wonder whether that's a semantic thing or a pragmatic thing. At first blush, it kind of seems like that's all pragmatic. So if you look at a range of examples in 8 through 10, if you find my wallet and return it to me, I'll pay you $500. Most native speakers of English sort of get the sense that that promise, if it's a promise, is effective only upon the finding and the returning of the wallet, so it's unilateral. If you exercise daily for a week, I'll pay you $500. Again, I owe you nothing until you've finished your exercises at the end of the week. But if you rent me your apartment for a week, I'll pay you $500, right? We get this idea that you can actually accept that offer by saying, sounds like a deal, right? Good deal, let's do it. And is there anything linguistic that would suggest a difference between those examples? Not apparently. But we will see that there are certain linguistic expressions that are apparently not interpreted as bilateral contractual offers when you would expect them to. In other words, they're interpreted only as unilateral offers, the kind of offer that demands performance for acceptance. And it seems to be related to their actual linguistic structure and not to pragmatics. So it may be semantics or syntax in the end. Okay, so how do we sort of get a grip on what we're talking about? How do we recognize a contractual offer when we see it? Are there any sort of linguistic cues for whether something is a contractual offer or something else? And I suggest that there are. So if you take the sentence in 11, if John gives Mary some candy, she will stay up later than usual. You might say that that's ambiguous in some sense of ambiguity. So meditate on it for a minute. Can you think of two interpretations of this sentence? Yeah. First one?
Cause and effect.
Yeah, right, cause and effect, exactly, which is how you might call them assertions when in conditional format, are often interpreted antecedent causes consequent, right? What's the other interpretation?
Contract, an offer of some kind.
Right, a contractual offer, right? Spoken on behalf of Mary's agent, perhaps to John's agent, right? So you might say there's a sense in which this thing is ambiguous between an assertion interpretation and an offer interpretation. And if you look at some of the classic, what do you want to say, syntactic, maybe semantic characteristics of conditional sentences, and ask whether those characteristics persist for contractual offer interpretations, you actually find that the answer is no. We've kind of already landed on the first one. So if you take 11, if John gives Mary some candy, she will stay up later than usual, and interpret that as a contractual offer. Who goes first? If John gives Mary some candy, she will stay up later than usual. Who goes first? John. Strong intuition? So it's impossible to interpret this to mean that John will give her candy in the morning? How about this? If you wash my car, I'll pay you $20. When is the money due? Right? So there's an entire body of law dedicated to filling in the gap that the law says is created in the contractual offer interpretation of conditional sentences. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. Great. Who goes first? So in a service contract, the law steps in and says that the service provider actually has to substantially perform before the duty to pay is due. How about in a sale of goods contract or a sale of land contract? The idea is that these are concurrent conditions, the parties go at the same time, neither party has to go first, right? But in the sort of pure assertion interpretation, maybe what we're thinking is cause and effect, maybe Mary is particularly sensitive to sugar, right? So if John gives her some candy, that will cause her later to stay up later than usual, right? There's just a natural kind of semantic directionality in terms of temporal precedence or maybe causation, but you just don't have that if you think hard about how you form and perform contracts every day. I promise you, you are forming and performing contracts every day, and you're often doing it with if-then language, and you're often doing it in such a way that you aren't conveying who goes first, which can cause marital dispute among any other sorts of problems in the real world. So one property of conditional sentences that seems to distinguish the offer from the assertion interpretations is this semantic directionality. Likewise, syntactic directionality. So it's kind of weird, right? If there's no semantic directionality, no order of performances, then why is it that the sentence in 14 is uninterpretable or apparently uninterpretable, at least for most, and at least with declarative intonation? Why is that not interpreted as, or interpretable as a contractual offer? If I give you $20, you'll wash my car. Right? There's just no way that's an offer. That may be a threat, right? But it's not an offer. It's not something that can be accepted. So this is bizarre, right? So we seem to have semantic non-directionality, but we still have syntactic directionality. What's that about? If you're into conditionals, if you're a linguist into conditionals, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Iatrito and Ippolito on what you might call distancing effects. So if you shift the tense and/or aspect in the antecedent and the consequent, you get a sort of modified interpretation of the sentence whereby there's maybe an inference that the events in the antecedent and consequent are unlikely, although perhaps not impossible, at least not in these examples. So if you look at 11a, if John gave Mary some candy, she would stay up later than usual. I'd kind of like to turn this into pure science and just run the experiment. I'll shut up for a few seconds, which is really difficult for me to do. You may have already gathered. I obviously love to talk. What's your intuition on reading 11a? Could that be a contractual offer that can be accepted with a mere promise? If John gave Mary some candy, she would stay up later than usual. Or is this just a point of negotiation, right? I'm throwing an idea out there on the table, right? So most speakers say, there are a few who say, no, I can imagine a context maybe where I feel like we're close enough to certainty that if you uttered 11a, then I feel like I could say it's a deal. but most don't. So most think of 11a as a point of negotiation and not as a contractual offer. And you might ask, why is that? So why is, in a way, sort of moving from certainty to probability or lack thereof, a way of shifting between an assertion interpretation into, or from an offer interpretation into a pure assertion interpretation. Finally, if you're a linguist and you're into conditionals, you have to have dealt with negative polarity items at some point in time. Bless you if you work in this area, because these, the proverbial herding of cats. Every time you think you've got a good story for negative polarity items, you find a counterexample, either in the world or at a conference, and then you have to go back to the drawing board. But let's just look at it. If you look at 11b, if John gives Mary any candy, she will stay up later than usual. If John gives Mary any candy, she will stay up later than usual. Now, I'm trying to be careful with my intonation. Are both interpretations available for 11b? Or is only one of them available? Okay, let's take a survey. Can you interpret that as an assertion, the sort of cause and effect? Yeah, that one's easy, right? There's no problem for the cause and effect assertion. How about contractual offer? If John gives Mary any candy, she'll stay up later than usual. I'm sensing some hesitation. Remember when I said at the beginning of the talk it's okay to be wrong? Number one, you can't be wrong in your judgments. And number two, even if you're in the minority, you're still right? But then number three, even if you're just plain wrong, that's okay, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to be wrong today, I promise it, so don't be afraid to be yourselves. I like it when people talk back to me, and I should have said at the beginning, you're welcome to interrupt at any time, either for points of clarification or even challenge, right? If not argument. So we have a kind of inventory of properties of conditional sentences that seem to correlate with whether we have an offer interpretation or a pure assertion interpretation. If you're a semanticist who believes that the story for MPIs is, they're licensed only in downward entailing environments or Strawson downward entailing environments, and that's a semantic explanation, then you might be sort of on the lookout for a semantic explanation of how an if-then sentence gets interpreted as a contractual offer. And you might say, you know what, the legal philosophers actually have it right. There must be some kind of promise element in the syntax that is dictating, right, all of these results. Maybe not. So let's pursue this. The two linguists, sort of self-described linguists who've looked at this in the past, Shane and Peter Tiersma, gave prototypes for contractual offers, or more precisely, conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers, shown here in 15 and 16. So Shane's prototype is basically a contractual offer of the if-then type must be semantically equivalent to the expression in 15, I promise that if you do X, I will do Y. In other words, for Shane, a contractual offer of the if-then type is a promise with conditional content. Whereas a Tiersma's archetype or prototype is the one given in 16, where you have a proposal to exchange promises. So an if-then interpretation of a contractual offer, or rather a contractual offer interpretation of an if-then is, I propose that if you promise to do X, I promise or will promise to do Y. Let's see if these work. Now, if you have your own theory of conditionals, again, bless you. I'm just going to borrow the sort of Stalnick or Lewis and eventually Kreitzerian type analysis where an if P then will Q sentence basically means in all foreseeable future situations in which P is true, Q is true. Right? So we're rejecting material implication for people who are wondering why we do that. There's a ton of data that's pretty convincing to the effect that that's not a good representation of natural language if-then. So let's try to do some plug and play and see if we can't find out whether the prototypes in 15 and 16 are good, whether it makes sense to sort of syntactically, rather, embed the promise element into the syntax so that we get the right result. Okay, so basically 18 is 15, just in a tree. So the idea is, maybe the meaning of a conditional sentence when interpreted as a contractual offer is, I promise is sort of represented by box. I promise that if X, then Y. Will that work? Well, not if you believe that promises, right, don't require acceptance, but offers do. So a contractual offer can't be a promise with conditional content if offers and promises are different in that respect. Okay, how about embedding the promise element somewhere? Let's put it, I think, in the most natural position in the consequent first. So 19, if X happens, then speaker promises Y. So for example, if you apply that to 11, if John gives candy, then Mary promises. Well, that's not quite right either, right? Because if you believe in bilaterality of contractual offers, right, a promise is good enough to create liability. Performance is not necessary, right? So this doesn't account for bilateral offers. It suggests that all offers are unilateral. And that's not right. Well, do we fix the problem by putting a promise in the antecedent and the consequent? No, that doesn't do any better, right? So if you take 20 and you apply that to 11, that basically means that the contractual offer interpretation of 11 is, if John promises, then Mary promises. That doesn't allow for bilateral offers in the sense that, and this is something that I haven't said before, the reason why we use bilateral is because there are two ways of accepting. I'm sort of shifting for the jurist, forgive me for speaking directly to you, not talking in terms of bilateral versus unilateral contracts, which is not particularly helpful, but rather bilateral versus unilateral offers. So if you believe in bilateral offers, what that means is you believe an offer can be accepted either by a promise to perform or, in fact, performance. So sort of turning back to that original car washing example, if you wash my car, I'll pay you $20, right? That's not demanding that you promise to wash it. In fact, what I'm bargaining for is worth, not words. I'm not bargaining for your words, right? I'm bargaining for your performance. So none of these, right? There doesn't seem to be a natural position in which you could embed the promise element, some silent promise element, into the syntax of a conditional if-then sentence, so that you end up with the natural interpretation of those sentences as contractual offers. So what do? What is the difference in meaning, as it were, between an offer interpretation of an if-then sentence and a pure assertion interpretation of an if-then sentence? You might say, well, just think harder about the semantics of conditionals. So if you believe the Kreitzerian story that there's always an implicit modal, and of course in these sentences you might say that will is actually not an implicit but rather an explicit modal. If you don't believe that future tense is tense, you believe that it's modality, then you say, okay, it's just a different accessibility relation, or it's just a different interpretation of will that dictates the difference between the pure assertion interpretation and the pure, the offer interpretation. Something along the lines of, when it's pure assertion, it's doxastic or epistemic or whatever it is that's just about the facts and not about the law. Whereas when it's the offer interpretation, will is interpreted deontically, right, or in some way so that it's about the law and not so much about the facts. I don't know that that helps us with any of the earlier data. Maybe some. But even if it does, contractual offers are both about the facts and about the law. Right? In other words, imagine I had uttered one. If you wash my car, I'll pay you $20. And then you wash my car and I refuse to pay. Right? And I say what I say here in 23. I said that if you washed my car, I'd have to pay you. Not that I actually would. Right? That's absurd. So in other words, when I said, if you wash my car, I will pay you, I was saying, I will pay you. And moreover, I was saying, I'm in trouble if I don't. Right? So that kind of like says, maybe there's a pragmatic way of explaining the shift in meaning between assertion interpretations of contractual offers and offer interpretations of contractual offers. I keep saying contractual offers when I mean conditional sentences, forgive me. I haven't been diagnosed, but I should go see a doctor sometime. A weird form of what I'm calling dyslexia, where I say the exact opposite of what I mean. And there are a couple of catastrophic typos in the handout to that effect, so if you catch them, please point them out to me, because I've forgotten where they are. Clear so far? The nature of the problem? Okay, so in my dissertation a few years ago, it was a midlife crisis, I freely confess. I wanted to go back and finish what I started. My dissertation from a few years ago was really modest in its ambition. I wasn't trying to solve this problem, but merely to suggest that a pragmatic solution is viable, not that it's the only possible solution. My ambition today is maybe even more modest. But in 2015, essentially what I'm going to do right now is say the story in my dissertation wasn't a very good one. I'm going to go through it very quickly in the interest of time. I know some of you have to leave maybe a little bit earlier than usual. So I guess I've got about a half hour left. Does that sound about right? Okay, so I should accelerate. The story in my dissertation was that maybe things that we already know happen in the pragmatics can help us resolve some of the data that we saw in the earlier section. So starting with, and I've lost my own page number, starting with, shifting ahead to the bottom basically of page 7, one way of explaining the semantic non-directionality of the offer interpretation of conditional sentences would be to ascribe it to conditional perfection. So conditional perfection is this idea that we often interpret, some say misinterpret, if-then sentences as only if-then sentences, right? And you might say that's perfectly natural in a contractual offer situation. So if I'm making you an offer, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. I'm not a very good negotiator, right? If I'm not suggesting that that's the only way you're going to get from me what you want, right? If you do for me what I want from you. So natural, in fact, this has been talked about for a long time. In fact, the original Wiki paper on conditional perfection had contractual offers in it without those being identified as contractual offers. So contractual offers are sort of natural candidates for conditional perfection. And if you look at the data in 30 through 32, you might ask yourself, what happens when you have an only if conditional, and how do you interpret the temporal order of the antecedent and consequent? Now, for me, my intuitions, they've spoiled by now. I'm not really sure what my intuitions are anymore, so let me ask you. In 30, again, this is just repeating what we've already said, if X happens, Y will happen. Natural interpretation of this is X precedes Y. Maybe X causes Y. Not saying that it's impossible to interpret it another way, but that's sort of the default interpretation. How about 31? Only if X happens, will Y happen. Only if X happens, will Y happen.
What's the question? Whether
Which happens first, X or Y? My sense is that even if you think X, I guess, you're a little less certain this time. Or you don't jump to the default of X preceding Y. So this is a potential explanation, and that's what I said in my definition, right? If contractual or conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers are naturally perfected conditionals, and if perfection of conditionals antagonizes, right, interpretation of antecedent, preceding, consequent, well then maybe that's why we don't get this sense of temporal precedence or causation in contractual offers. Turns out, got a great question for you, I keep getting your vowel wrong. I've done it for 5 years, forgive me. You can have unperfected, what you might call unperfected contractual offers, and you still don't get the temporal precedence. So look at 11C. Heck, even if John gives Mary some gum, she'll stay up later than usual. Now it's kind of difficult to interpret this as an only if in light of the fact that I've already put out an if then. And yet, I think you'll agree with me that you don't have any temporal precedence. So if you can have a lack of temporal precedence in unperfected contexts, then it wasn't the perfection that was causing, presumably, the lack of precedence. Okay, how about syntactic directionality? The original story for the syntactic directionality, remembering again that if I say, if I give you $20, you'll wash my car, that can't be an offer. What I sort of said was, well, conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers are in fact assertions that are pragmatically strengthened into offers with this sort of pragmatic sense of liability. And so the reason why it's weird to say that as an offer is because it's weird to say you will wash my car, right, as a promise. Or in other words, right, I'm being presumptive, right, when I'm telling you what you will do in the future. But come on, presumption? I know a lot of presumptuous attorneys, and they would have no problem agreeing with me about the data. I think that's, you know, kind of a cop-out story. How about tense and mood? In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into these details, but the gist of it was that some of the linguists who've looked at this say that the distancing effects that you see when you have a if John gave as opposed to if John gives scenario derives from the fact that you made an assertion that was different from the assertion you would have made if you had said if John gives. In other words, it's all about the assertion hood. And I'm like, well, okay, so how can we explain the distancing effects in contractual offers if these aren't also assertions? But that's just saying, okay, at some level they're assertions, and we probably were already convinced of that. That's not to say that, right, there's a pragmatic explanation for the distancing effects or anything like it. So I don't think it really helps in promoting the idea that this is all pragmatics. What about MPIs? Well, I entertained in my dissertation several potential solutions to the MPI problem. I think that there's, well actually let me give you one cat that sort of refuses to be herded. It's the data at the bottom of 11C. Now here I've underlined any, and I want you to put focus on it. So if John gives Mary any candy, she will stay up later than usual. This is example 11C at the bottom of page 10. If John gives Mary any candy, she will stay up later than usual. What do you think? Can that be accepted? If John gives Mary any candy. Yeah, right? Yeah. So isn't that interesting? So if John gives Mary any candy, she'll stay, that can't be an offer, but if John gives Mary any candy, right? Some minimum, right? Now I'm not saying that the law would enforce this because we know that the law always requires a quantity, right? And you might say a minimum undefined quantity is not a quantity, right? Enforceable or interpretable under the law. But we have this linguistic intuition that that's interpretable as an offer. So minimizing MPs, right, are okay. So the data gets in a way even worse, but I think sort of better for the final story. If you look at 11D, it's not just that you can't have unfocused any in the antecedents of conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers, just that if you're going to have an unfocused any in a conditional sentence interpreted as a contractual offer, it can't be in the wrong place. So this is not the best example, but what I'm trying to do is create a double object antecedent where one of the objects is a focused any and the other is an unfocused any, and show you that's still interpretable as a contractual offer, even though you have an unfocused any, right, in one of the objects. So if you donate, I'm going to mess up with the intonation because I'm already speaking too fast. If you donate some of your money to any charity, we'll hold a dinner in your honor. Might get better if you pluralize it. If you donate some money to any charities, we'll hold a dinner in your honor. Versus, if you donate any money to any charity, we'll hold a dinner in your. No, that doesn't work. So I guess what we're getting at here is that if you believe that even minimizing any can refer to some quantity, but unfocused any cannot, well, this kind of makes sense for the jurists, because if we're going to bargain, we kind of have to have some understanding of how much is going to be exchanged between us. And so if any unfocused any can't refer to a quantity, right? Well, then maybe a natural interpretation of this MPI data is just that unfocused any can't refer to a quantity, and contractual offers have to refer to a quantity, because quantities are being exchanged. I think that's a much better story, not the story that I told in my dissertation. I told no story in my dissertation. But yet another cat is ever. So if you believe that any and ever belong to the same family, or some same family. They're both NPIs. You might ask, okay, what about ever? Can you have ever in the antecedent of a conditional sentence interpreted as a contractual offer? And I think the answer is yes, but only if you interpret the contractual offer as a unilateral offer. So have a look at 11C at the top of page 11. If John ever gives Mary some candy, she will stay up later than usual. If John ever gives Mary some candy, she will stay up later than usual. The response can't be, I accept. On behalf of John, I accept. Now, maybe focused ever works, but unfocused doesn't seem to. Although, I think we might agree that if John actually gives the candy, now we have liability. So this may be interpretable as a contractual offer, but not interpretable as a bilateral contractual offer. Why is that? So I'm now actually sort of shifting focus away from the original question, which was, is there some linguistic reason for believing that conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers are conditional promises? I'm sort of moving away from that. I'm moving more toward this, why is it that certain linguistic expressions are interpreted, when interpreted as contractual offers, only as unilateral offers and not as bilateral offers? Why are there apparently syntactic restrictions on which linguistic expressions can be interpreted unilaterally as opposed, or bilaterally as opposed to unilaterally? So toward the end of the page, look at 49 and 50. Everyone who brings me candy will get an A. Or everyone who brings me candy gets an A. Probably interpretable as a contractual offer, but only a unilateral one, right? You can't say, I accept. We have a deal. And similarly, the pseudo-imperative in 50, bring me candy and I'll give you an A. Okay, I think if you bring me candy, I owe you an A, assuming that my administration will let me get away with that. Right, I don't think you can say, I accept. It's a deal. So why is this? Wow. I've gone slower this time, I think, maybe than I've ever gone before. I really want to be respectful of your time. I've got 15 minutes remaining. So let me shift ahead to a potential solution, which is probably more science fiction than science. And I don't mean to suggest that this is the only way of solving the problem, but I think it's kind of a natural idea to entertain and maybe eventually reject. Could it be that at some level of representation, conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers actually involve questions? The kind of question that can be answered by, yes, I will do that. Or, in other words, I accept. Right? Because that's the nature of a bilateral offer. And so I borrowed on some work that I had done in a completely different area, having to do with the condition on extraction domains. Right, so for the linguists in the room, right, there's this idea that it's much easier to extract from an object than it is to extract from a subject or from an adjunct, right? And there's some really interesting data for certain speakers of English that make it look like these speakers aren't respecting the condition on extraction domain. This is the data at the top of page 15 and 56. Who do you think's kissing Mary angered John? Who do you think's kissing Mary angered John? Sure looks like what that asking is, who is the person such that you think that person's kissing Mary angered John? If you believe that that's sort of the way the syntax works, then we have extraction from a subject, which is not supposed to happen. So I tell a fancy story that I'm not going to get into here that says, oh, no, actually that's not the way that sentence works out. Actually, do you think is not where you think it is. It's actually, what do you think, merged into the syntax. So it's basically the question, who's kissing Mary angered John? What do you think? And what do you think is getting integrated into the syntax? And some magic happens and it comes out the way it's pronounced. What I'm suggesting is that there is perhaps independent reason for believing that you can integrate a question into an assertion. And if that's true, then maybe the way that conditional sentences interpreted as contractual offers are interpreted as contractual offers, in particular bilateral offers, is by virtue of the fact that there has actually been a question integrated into their assertion. Could that work? I kind of sketch a way in which you can make the semantics work. I won't bore you with that. But the gist of it is, what if sentence number 1, if you wash my car, I'll pay you $20, when interpreted as a bilateral contractual offer, is at some level of representation. If you wash my car, I'll pay you $20. Will you wash my car? If so, then we get the right result. Or as close as we've ever gotten to the right result. Right? Because we know that you can accept either by washing, or in fact, I'm saying, yes, I will, or I will wash your car. A good question is, why is the answer not yes? Why is the answer not, or why is the answer I accept? But I think that we can sort of work around that. What do we get? What's the payoff for complicating the syntax and the semantics? The answer is the idea that, well, if you believe that imperatives aren't propositions, maybe they're properties, and some linguists believe that. If you believe that relative clauses, everyone who gives me candy gets an A, if you believe that relative clauses are properties and not propositions, and you borrow some other data from Buffington that says that you can integrate questions into propositions but not properties, then you actually get exactly what you want. The reason why certain linguistic expressions, the relative clause version of the contractual offer, everyone who brings me candy gets an A, or the pseudo-imperative version of the offer, bring me candy and I'll give you an A. Maybe the reason why those aren't interpreted bilaterally is because you can't integrate a question into their semantics. Do we get any additional payoff? Well, maybe. So I'm now on to page 18, and I apologize for having skipped so dramatically. Do we have any potential explanation for the semantic non-directionality? Well, yeah. If at some level of representation, there's an assertion and a question, each of them has their own will. If you wash my car, I'll pay you $20. Will you wash my car? Yes, I will. We have two wills, right? Each of which comes with its own time parameters, so maybe that's why we have semantic non-directionality. How about syntactic directionality? Why is it that I can't say if you wash, I'm sorry, if I give you $20, here we go, you'll wash my car, right? Why is that not interpretable as a contractual offer? Well, maybe that's because it's really weird to ask yourself the question, will I give you $20? Right? Okay. I'm not going to get into remoteness, tense, and mood, except to say that if there's a will you wash my car? Right? Maybe that's a kind of parasitic tense, and putting actual tense, or maybe even fake tense, into the semantic actually sort of antagonizes the parasitic relation between the wills. That may be true science fiction. Let's get to negative polarity items and focus just on ever. So why is it that when we have a conditional sentence interpreted as a contractual offer with ever in the antecedent, it apparently is interpreted only unilaterally, not bilaterally? Well, maybe the reason for that is whatever explains the fact that you can't respond to 65 with 66. Will John ever give Mary some candy? Yes. Now, I'm not saying that you can't say that, but there's something utterly uncooperative about that, right? Yes, tomorrow, right, is a lot more cooperative. So, yeah, there's a lot more that I'd like to say and had hoped to say. In fact, if you are willing to walk a certain distance down this path with me and say that, okay, maybe if you've got a proposition in the right place, you can integrate a question into that proposition and thereby create a contractual offer. There are probably lots of proposition-containing expressions that you can't interpret as a contractual offer. Why is that, right? Joe, are you suggesting that, right, integratability is a necessary condition, a sufficient condition? How do you handle unless examples? And so what I really wanted to do today was to talk about some new work, some new thoughts that I have on how to handle unless examples. but I'm getting the sense that maybe I've already exhausted your patience, and I know that some of you have to run off early, so maybe the better strategy would be to save the questions about amounts to the Q&A period if anyone is interested. Fair enough?
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, all right.
We accept.
And you accept? One other thing, yeah, it's a deal. One other thing I had hoped to talk about today, but I think would also be better saved for the Q&A session is like, how does any of this fit into the other camp? That camp that says, wait a minute, Kratzer, Stalnaker, Lewis, they're all wrong. Conditional sentences aren't sentences with conditions. Conditional sentences are actually conditional speech acts, right? They're conditional assertions. I'm just beginning this process. I think that there are some ways of suggesting that this data makes it seem like any story that says that conditional sentences are in fact conditional speech acts, conditional assertions, might not work. But I don't have a lot to say about that except this, and this is kind of the data point that I want to leave you with, because it's the kind of thing that might keep you up at night as well, and that'll make me feel better about the fact that I'm up at night. So if you believe that a contractual offer is a conditional promise, and now I'm really talking about the conditional speech act kind of thing, okay? I'm not making you any promises until you do for me what I'm asking you to do for me, or you promise to do for me what I'm asking you to do for me, something along those lines. In the meantime, I've got nothing. And this is sort of reminiscent of those non-apologies. If I offended you, I'm sorry, right? I don't even know how to interpret those things. A lot of people say that they're not apologies, and maybe that's actually evidence that there are such things as conditional speech acts, but I don't know. Here's the thing that really bothers me. If your contractual offer is a conditional promise, then why can I not accept in the following way? I'll do it, and you hereby promise to do it as well. We know that you can use hereby on behalf of someone else. The president hereby awards you, the following, right? And indeed, like, you can imagine a situation where you've got a mediator in a divorce. Forgive me, may I use the two of you, right? You hereby promise to pay child support. That's not that bad, right? And there are legal philosophers who believe that the essence of contract is essentially turning over a little bit of your authority to someone else. You're giving them the authority to bind you. They're, in a way, your agent, or sort of agent star, right? But if all of that is true, why can I not accept a contractual offer by saying, it's a deal. You hereby promise to do what you promise to do. That's nonsense. It doesn't work that way. So I don't know how to, if you believe in the conditional assertion type analysis of conditional sentences, or you believe that there are such things as conditional speech acts, and you think that that's the vehicle for explaining the contractual offer interpretation of conditional sentences, I don't know how you overcome that challenge. I've entertained a couple of ways, but I don't find either of those ways satisfying. So, in the 2 minutes that I have left, I'll just wrap up. I'm not suggesting necessarily that any of this is right. Although there does seem to be a kind of intuitive correctness to the idea that when I'm making you a contractual offer, I'm not just making an assertion, and I'm, in fact, not even making any promises, but I am asking a question. At the very least, do you accept? It may make sense to think of at least bilateral contractual offers as assertions with questions integrated into their syntax and semantics. That's it. Thank you very much for your